The Life Through Wildlife Strategic Plan 2025 to 2029 outlines a vision for developing an inclusive $30 billion wildlife economy in southern Africa.
I'm a professor at the University of Florida, where I've got a lot of latitude in building a program in African conservation. The poorest people often live with the best wildlife. And somehow we have to link up livelihoods at household level with the management of wildlife as an economic resource.
The plan focuses on transforming conservation efforts by prioritizing community-led governance, sustainable financing, and knowledge-based capacity building. These are the key aspects of the strategic plan: historical context and evolution. 1960 to 1975. Legacy conservation efforts focused on parks but failed outside protected areas. 1975 to 1990. Wildlife flourished when ownership was granted to private landholders. 1990 to 2005. Southern Africa pioneered community-based natural resource management, CBNRM, gaining global attention. 2005 to 2020. External conservation projects overshadowed local innovation. 2020 to 2024. Life Through Wildlife emerged to revitalize the wildlife economy and CBNRM.
So in the last 20 years, what I've seen is quite a lot of loss of intellectual capacity and understanding, and it's gone far more towards large NGOs managing wildlife projects, whereas Campfire was set up as a rural development project that used wildlife.
Core goal: a thriving wildlife economy.
So our first objective is to try and increase the wildlife economy from what it is at the moment, which is 3 billion, to about 30 billion. And our economic research shows that's quite possible.
Wildlife population growth: increase from 15 to 150 million animals. Expansion of wildlands to cover over 40% of the region. Improving livelihoods, targeting 1,000 communities for better rights, empowerment, and financial opportunities. Sustainable financing, direct investment into well-governed communities and properties.
In the last 2 or 3 years, I've trained about 90 Africans working for NGOs and in sites in at least 10 or 11 countries in Africa. And what we found is, even working for large NGOs with big projects, they almost universally lack any knowledge about governance, and they almost universally lack any knowledge about economics. So we realize there's a major gap.
Strategic focus areas. 1. Building African capacity and knowledge. Addressing the decline in conservation knowledge. Strengthening institutions for sustainable governance. Training young professionals in wildlife management. 2. Developing a community-led wildlife economy. Enhancing CBNRM governance for stronger local leadership. Encouraging participatory governance rather than top-down management. 3. Securing financing and investment for wildlife economies. Establishing direct payments for environmental services. Attracting impact investors to finance community-based conservation. 4. Creating a learning network for knowledge sharing. Supporting regional networks to drive conservation transformation. Strengthening communication between stakeholders.
What we're doing is we're really empowering the people at the bottom who've been disempowered and marginalized. I mean, the whole colonial system was set up, A, to marginalize these people, and B, to extract their resources. And in some countries, the post-colonial system really likes that, and they are disempowering people and extracting their resources.
Key issues addressed. Colonial conservation policies often excluded local communities. Weak land and wildlife ownership rights led to economic stagnation. Inefficient conservation funding hindered progress. Wildlife trade bans created unintended negative impacts. Climate change and ecosystem degradation threaten conservation success.
What we found is that the communities like the ownership and sovereignty over wildlife. If they can make the decisions over the wildlife and they can decide quotas and they get the benefits, then they really like wildlife. So they like their wildlife. If it's your wildlife, maybe they're not so sure about that.
Proposed solutions. Recognizing landholders' rights to benefit from wildlife. Developing wildlife markets for hunting, ecotourism, and sustainable meat production. Reducing regulatory barriers that limit wildlife-based economies. Scaling up successful conservation models to cover more land.
Despite animals in their field, despite poor governance, despite economic underperformance, they want more animals because they see it as their future. Our role is to unlock them as the custodians of wildlife.
Educational and training programs. Micro-accreditation for field professionals. Graduate certificates and master's programs in wildlife governance. Research on the economic viability of community conservation models.
And of course we face a lot of constraints. One is that government often inherited a colonial attitude that they own the resource, and then we're fighting with hunting bans all the time that are effectively placing trade sanctions on rural communities, bans on ivory, bans in rhino horn, bans on all sorts of things, because the West doesn't know how to cope with conservation. They have the wrong model. They basically alienate the communities. The greater conservation world underappreciates how much these people live with wildlife and can look after it, because if they don't, no one else can.
Final vision. By 2029, the plan envisions a self-sustaining wildlife economy. Communities empowered through ownership and governance. Conservation policies driven by African-led solutions rather than external influence.
We're trying to make sure that the indigenous species, which is logical, become the cornerstone of the economy. We need cattle and livestock to make food, but what we tend to do is push them into the most marginal areas where they really damage the environment and they don't make money. They tend to be supported from money from people living in town, and they're kept as a cultural activity. 96% of global biomass is people and livestock. Wildlife is 4%. That's an outcome of a distorted way we manage animals. So we own livestock and therefore we look after them. We deny people living with wildlife the ownership. So you've got a choice. I can look after the government's kudu or buffalo, or I can look after my own cow. Well, everyone makes a choice to look after their own cow, as everybody would do. What we've discovered in Southern Africa is looking after the buffalo or the kudu is 2 to 4 times as profitable as looking after your cow. So by giving the ownership of the wildlife back to landholders, we've seen an increase from about 1 million wild animals on private land to about 10 million in the last 20 years, which is probably the most successful conservation program anywhere in the world in the last 70 years.